Morning, Mr. Hardy.
Good morning.
You understand you're still under oath.
Yes,
And did you talk to anybody about this case last night?
I did not.
You work for PA Consultants, is that correct?
PA Consulting Group, that's correct.
And has PA Consulting Group done any other work for Invenergy or any of its related companies besides this project?
We have, yes.
And what other projects have you worked on?
We've worked on the Lackawanna project.
That's the one in Pennsylvania.
That's the one in Pennsylvania, yes. We've done some work related to wind facilities in Texas. Those are the two that are most front of mind. I think we've done some other work for them as well.
Okay.
Some of those I've been involved with, and some of them I have not.
Has PA Consulting ever testified, or have you, let me start with you, have you ever testified against the power plant?
I don't know that I've ever testified for or against the power plant. I've testified, based on the analysis that I've been asked to conduct.
Have you ever had a client that was opposing a power plant that you worked for?
No, I have not.
Okay. I would like to turn to the November 6th ISO FERC filing that is labeled as GCW2 to Barvolts 39. Do you have that? There are two November 6th FERC filings. This is the one dealing with qualification. Do you have that FERC filing? I think they're going to bring it up on the screen anyway.
Okay.
It's attached to Glenn Walker's December 14th, 2018. Yes, that's it. You familiar with that?
Yes.
You understand this is a filing by ISO with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and it deals with qualifications for forward capacity market that's coming up in February.
Yes.
In the last paragraph, the last three lines, it talks about the 13th forward capacity auction, and that'll be held on February 4th, 2019, and that's your understanding, correct?
That's correct.
And it says that that auction, starting with the word will in the second line up from the bottom, will procure the needed capacity for the 6-state New England control area. Do you see that?
Yes.
Can you agree with that, correct?
I do.
Now, if we could look at page 4, please. The third paragraph. Do you see the first sentence? It says the installed capacity requirement, ICR, for the 13th capacity commitment period is 34,719 megawatts. Do you see that?
I do.
And you understand that is the ICR for the upcoming FCA?
That's correct.
There's a footnote there, though, and the footnote goes down to 10. And it says this value does not include Clear River Unit 1, correct?
That's correct. So the ISO calculated ICR values both with and without Clear River, given the uncertainty around Clear River. With its CSO being terminated, they're using the ICR calculation that did not include Clear River.
Good. Now the third line in that paragraph also, well, the second and third line then accounts for the Hydro-Quebec 969 megawatts and comes up with a net ICR value of 33,750, correct?
That's correct.
Now, I think we just touched on this yesterday, but the similar net ICR value for FCA 12 was almost the same, a difference of only 25 megawatts, correct?
It was 25 megawatts lower, that's correct.
On the next page, please, 5. The first 3 bullet points, I'd like to just go through them with you. Qualified existing capacity resources for the auction total 34,925 megawatts of existing capacity, correct?
I think maybe that's...
Take your time and read it.
Is it possible to make that bigger on the screen?
First bullet point, if you could enlarge it. So at the end, it gives the total 34,925 megawatts of existing capacity, correct?
That's correct.
We already established earlier on that the net ICR for this auction is 33,750, correct? That's on the first page.
That's correct.
So qualified existing capacity exceeds the net ICR, correct? I understand there's other factors, but in terms of those two, it exceeds.
In terms of those two numbers, that's
Right.
correct.
Now, the second bullet point talks about static delist bids. These are retirement bids, correct?
That's correct.
And that's a total of 3,223, correct?
Correct.
The third bullet point talks about qualified new capacity resources that were qualified by ISO, and there were 238 of them, totaling 8,716 megawatts, correct?
That's correct.
Mr. McElroy, I lost track of, could you just remind us the date and this document?
November 6th, 2018,
Thank you.
filed with FERC by ISO, approved by FERC, and it establishes the numbers for the upcoming auction. Now, we touched on this briefly yesterday, but I'd like to talk about it just a little bit more, and I'm done with that document. If you want to queue it up, the next document I'm going to be talking about is the other November 6th filing with ISO, by ISO with FERC, which is GCW3. That'll come up next, but I have a couple of preliminary questions. We talked about the Energy Facilities Siting Act, and you conceded that you had read the act, correct?
Yes.
And one of the things we talked about is that the statute requires that the board make a finding before it licenses a plant, that the plant is, quote, justified by long-term state and/or regional energy need forecasts, end quote. That's in 42-98-2, correct?
That's correct.
And there's a second part of that in 42-98-11, which requires that this board not license a plant unless it finds that it is, quote, necessary to meet the needs of the state and/or region for energy of the type to be produced by the proposed facility, end quote, correct?
That's correct.
Right. Now, regional need forecasts are currently done by ISO New England, correct?
They are.
And the process that ISO New England goes through in order to establish these regional need forecasts is explained in great detail in filings that ISO makes with FERC, correct?
Correct.
So I'd like to now look at that FERC filing of November 6th, which is GCW3, attached to Glenn Walker's December 14, 2018 testimony. So you've seen this before, correct?
I have.
And again, it's an ISO filing with FERC, November 6, 2018, and in the subject line it deals with the filing of installed capacity requirement for the upcoming auction, correct?
Correct.
If we could go to the second page, please. The bottom paragraph just below the bullet, maybe you could enlarge it a little. Thank you. It says the body of this filing letter describes the set of proposed ICR-related values without Clear River Unit 1 in the model, correct?
That's correct.
And then it says that an alternative set of values, which is the ICR-related values with Clear River Unit 1 in the model, are included in the attachment 1 to this filing, correct?
That's correct.
And then it points out that notably, the differences between the values are very small, correct?
That's correct.
And the bullet point makes the calculation and says the installed capacity requirement without Clear River Unit 1 in the model is 20 megawatts. Going to the next page, lower, as you pointed out earlier, than the installed capacity requirement with Clear River Unit 1 in the model, correct?
You said that I pointed that out earlier?
You did. It was yesterday's testimony.
Oh, I thought you meant this morning when we were talking about the 25 megawatt difference. I just want to
No.
make sure. Okay.
This is
Yep.
the 20 megawatt difference
Okay.
with and without Clear River
Yes.
1. You would agree that that's a small difference?
It's a small difference, and it makes sense. I mean, this is, the installed capacity requirement is a demand calculation, so a lot of what goes into this demand calculation is contingency modeling around large-scale transmission outages and how much, essentially how much additional capacity above peak load is required for the system to operate reliably. So any one plant's impact on the demand side of things, not supply, but on the demand side of things, should be relatively small.
Could we look at page 8, please? (3A), if you could enlarge the first sentence of A down at the bottom. Thank you. So it says here that the installed capacity requirement is a measure of the installed resources that are projected to be necessary to meet reliability standards in light of total forecasted load requirements for the New England control area and to maintain sufficient reserve capacity to meet reliability standards. That's your understanding of what the installed capacity requirement is, correct?
That's correct.
If we could go to page 9, please. The very bottom. Number 1. Load forecast. Thank you. Under this heading, load forecast, ISO states the forecasted peak loads of the entire New England control area for the 2022 to 2023 capacity commitment period are one major input into the calculation. Thank you. I'm going over to the next page. Thank you. Of the ICR related values. You understand that to be correct, right?
Yes.
And going down to the third line, it says the ISO used the load forecast. Do you see that? In the third line? Load forecast published in the 2018-2027 forecast report of capacity, energy, loads, and transmission dated May 1, 2018, parens, 2018 cell report, parens. You see that?
Yes.
You understand that that's how these forecasts are done?
Do.
We could go to page 20, please. Under Romans 7, stakeholder process, the first sentence. Now, you understand that ISO does not make these forecasts in a vacuum, that they have input from other stakeholders.
Yes.
So this describes that stakeholder process, and the first sentence says, the ISO, in consultation with NEPOOL and other interested parties, developed the proposed ICR-related values for FCA 13 through an extensive stakeholder process over the course of 8 months. Do you see that?
I do.
You know what NEPOOL is, correct?
Yes.
And could you briefly describe it for the board?
It's short for New England Power Pool. I mean, it's a collection of essentially the parties that are involved in New England, either on the load or generator side.
There's a lot of those parties.
There's a lot of those parties, that's right.
Now, this filing also contains testimony on behalf of ISO. And what I'd like to do is, part of this filing is the Sedlicek and Shabeli testimony, and I'd like to go to page 6. It's at the back of the file. It's an attachment. Oh, thank you. Yes, that's it. And if you could enlarge the chart, please. Thank you. You're familiar with this. You've seen this testimony, correct?
I have.
And this table 1 is the comparison of ICR related values without Clear River Unit 1 in the model and with Unit 1 in the model, correct?
Yes.
And it shows that in the second box down, the net installed capacity requirement, net of Hydro-Quebec, is 33,750, which we've already established, correct?
Yes,
And that the value with Clear River Unit 1 is 33,770, correct?
that's correct. It would be 20 megawatts higher.
And that the impact of not including Clear River Unit 1 is 20 megawatts lower in the next column, correct?
On net ICR.
Correct.
Yes.
Yes. Could we go to page 13, please? Now, in the middle of the page, there's a heading called Load Forecast. Do you see that?
Yes.
The question asked is, please explain how the ISO derives the load forecast assumption used in developing the installed capacity requirement and related values. Do you see that?
Yes.
And the first, beginning on line 15, going through line 18, the first explanation is, for probabilistic-based calculations of ICR-related values, the ISO develops a forecasted distribution of typical daily peak loads for each week of the year based on 40 years of historical weather data and an economically estimated, I'm sorry I said the word wrong, econometrically, thank you very much, estimated monthly model of typical daily peak loads. Did I finally read that correctly?
Yes,
Thank you. And you understand that's how it's done.
I do.
And it's a complex calculation that ISO performs.
Absolutely.
Lines 21 through 22, starting with the probabilistic-based, says the probabilistic-based calculations take into account all possible forecast load levels for the year. You agree with that? That's exactly what they do, correct?
That's certainly what their goal is to do, yes.
And on page 14, please, in the middle of the page, starting with line 10. The question is, please describe the forecasted load within capacity zones for FCA 13, which is associated with the 2022 to 2023 capacity commitment period. Do you see that question?
I do.
And the answer says, the forecasted load for the SENE capacity zone, that's our zone, correct?
Senior zone, yeah.
Right, was developed using the combined load forecast for the state of Rhode Island and a load share ratio of the SEMA and NEMA Boston load to the forecasted load for the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Do you see that?
I do.
And you know that that's
It might be helpful to people if you explained what all of those acronyms mean.
I'll let you do it, Mr. Hardy. SENE, Southeast New England?
That's Southeast New England, yeah. So that the SENE zone basically comprises the state of Rhode Island, SEMA, which is Southeast Massachusetts, and NEMA, which is Northeast Massachusetts. So it's, the way you can think about it, it's all of Rhode Island and then a portion of Massachusetts. So this is describing how they get that share of load. It's all of Rhode Island, and then it's a ratio of Massachusetts load based on the portion of Massachusetts that's included in SENE.
And can those zones change?
They can change. In fact, they did change. I'll get the dates wrong, but going back a few auctions, SENE was a new zone that was created. Previous to that, it was SEMA Rhode Island, so it was Rhode Island with Southeast Massachusetts. They've now included Northeast Massachusetts, and they call that the SENE zone.
And why would it change?
So the ISO will conduct, as we've discussed, a lot of modeling around transmission, where congestion is, where load is, and all that stuff can change from year to year. So they're continually updating their models and figuring out, on a capacity basis, what are the applicable zones. In this particular case, what we've seen in the last couple auctions and what our understanding is going forward is SENE is one of the 3 zones that will be modeled from a capacity market basis. And SENE is modeled as an import constrained zone.
And what does that mean, import constrained?
Import constrained means that there is the potential for when they clear capacity to meet that net ICR, there is the potential that CNE could break out. And when they say break out, meaning the capacity price would clear at a premium to rest of Pool or Northeast New England, which are the other two zones.
And why would that happen?
That would happen if, because CNE relies on imports in many cases. So to the extent that the number of imports that are required to satisfy that load requirement exceed the amount of imports that can actually be done on a physical basis.
That's what they mean by congestion?
Congestion is one way to put it, yes. Or constraint or congestion, yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Mr. Hardy, just to follow up on that a little bit, although Rhode Island is within a defined import constrained zone, you mentioned that there's a potential it could break out and be a price differential, correct?
That's correct.
But there hasn't been a price differential in recent years, correct?
So there was a price differential for FCA 8 and FCA 9. There has not been a price differential for FCA 10, 11, and 12.
And during 8 and 9, that was not the SENE zone, the SENE zone, correct?
It was the SEMA Rhode Island zone. So Rhode Island was part of the zone that was import constrained and cleared at a premium.
But since FCA 9, there's been no premium.
That's correct.
If we could look at page 34, please.
One quick question. Mr. Hardy, what do you think the clearing price will be for FCA 13?
That's a great question.
A lot of people are listening.
I'm not sure today, like on the spot. It kind of depends on a number of factors. We're continually updating our models. I mean, one of the big uncertainties that we were watching was the situation around Mystic 8 and 9. We now have more certainty that Mystic 8 and 9 will be included. So I couldn't put a price on it. I think it probably, while CNE is an import constrained zone, I don't think that it will clear at a premium in this next auction. And I would expect the price will be somewhere in the neighborhood of where it cleared in the previous auction.
Don't people pay you or your company a lot of money for those predictions?
In some cases, yes. Can we make this part of the confidential?
We don't want to undercut your business.
If we could look at page 34, it's up on the screen.
Okay.
Line 9, what amount of system reserves did the ISO use in the determination of the probabilistic ICR-related values? You see that question?
Yes.
We discussed this and touched on it a little bit yesterday, but this is the ISO explanation of that change in the reserve assumption, correct?
Yes.
So the answer was this year, the ISO used 700 megawatts as the amount of system reserve in the determination of the probabilistic ICR-related values. This is an increase of 500 megawatts over the 200 megawatt value assumed in the past, correct?
That's correct.
And that 200 megawatt value had been in effect for a long time, correct?
Yes, I believe that 200 megawatt value was based on a study from 1991.
And for all of the auctions that have occurred to date, they've used the 200 megawatt value.
That's correct.
But for the upcoming auction, it increased to 500. It increased by 500.
That's correct.
Next page, please, 35. Lines 6 through 9. ISO asks the question, what is the impact of using 700 megawatts of system reserves in the determination of the installed capacity requirement? And the answer is the use of the 700 megawatt reserve assumption increased the installed capacity requirement by 550 megawatts, correct?
That's correct.
The next question then says, does that mean that the installed capacity requirement for FCA 13 is 550 megawatts higher than the installed capacity requirement for FCA 12? And the answer was no. Due to the decline in the projected loads determined as part of the load forecast for 2018 versus those forecasted in 2017, the net installed capacity requirement for FCA 13, 33,750 megawatts, is only 25 megawatts higher than the net installed capacity requirement for FCA 12, 33,725 megawatts. Thus, the impact of the increase in the system reserve assumption is effectively netted out by the decline in the load forecast for 2018 used in the calculation of the FCA 13 ICR related values. Did I read that correctly?
You did.
And you understand that that's the conclusion that ISO reached?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great summary, and I think that speaks to the point that, you know, outside of just absolute peak demand, there are a number of factors that impact net ICR on a year-to-year basis.
And I think we touched on this briefly yesterday, but if the FCA reserve assumption had been the same as it had been in many previous years, then the net ICR would have gone down by almost 500 megawatts, correct?
If they use the assumption from 1991, that's correct.
Now I'd like to bring up CLF 19, please. As a introduction, Mr. Elmer questioned you yesterday regarding a document that was filed by Invenergy in one of the cases before FERC related to the termination of the Unit 1 CSO. You recall that questioning?
Yes.
And you know that there were actually two cases before FERC, correct? There was a case regarding the termination in which Invenergy attempted to persuade FERC not to terminate, and then there was a separate case where Invenergy sought a waiver from the tariff. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
All right. So this CLF 19 is the document that filed by Invenergy that was not discussed with Mr. Elmer yesterday. And I'd like to run through a couple of points with you. Have you had a chance to see this before?
I'm not sure if I've read this particular document.
If as we go through it, you have no familiarity with it, just let me know and I'll move on.
Okay.
If you look at on the first page in the second paragraph, starting with the fourth line, the sentence begins, the CSO subject to termination was assigned in the 12th forward capacity auction, FCA 12. Do you see that?
I do.
That's a mistake, isn't it? Wasn't the terminated CSO assigned in the 10th forward capacity auction?
Yes, I was just reading the rest of the paragraph.
Yeah, no problem. Take it. As I said before.
I think that's correct.
So that was a mistake.
I believe so, yes.
On the second page, please. You see where it says, if you could enlarge the last paragraph above the footnotes. Clear River does not dispute ISO NE's authority to make termination filings. Rather, the questions presented by the termination filing are, first, whether the circumstances presented here, and here is bolded, represent the egregious, and egregious is bolded, case for which termination is, going to the next page please, reserved, with a footnote, and if so, second, whether Clear River's waiver request nevertheless satisfies all of the Commission's criteria for it to be granted. You're familiar with Invenergy's position in that regard, correct?
Yes.
And the footnote says, footnote 9 at the very bottom, if you could enlarge it just a little, please. As ISO has made clear over at least 4 years, at least the last 4 years, termination of a CSO must be reserved for the most egregious being bolded, cases. You see that, correct?
Yes,
Now, FERC denied the waiver request, correct?
that's correct.
And FERC terminated the CSO, correct?
They approved ISO's termination of the CSO.
I agree with that. Would you agree, therefore, that this must be an egregious case?
I believe that's the ISO or FERC's determination. That's not my opinion. I don't have an opinion on whether it's an egregious case or not.
But you would agree that ISO and FERC must have come to that conclusion? I'm not asking what your opinion was, but they must have had that opinion.
I don't know. I'm not sure that they used the terminology egregious. I guess we'd have to look at the ISO filing and then FERC's approval to see if they use the word egregious. I know that the word egregious is in this waiver request, but I don't know that FERC or ISO New England used the word egregious.
But you're aware that,
I think it's been asked and answered.
thank you, I'll move on. If we could go to page 8, please. At the very top of the page, the top paragraph. You see that Invenergy is arguing there that yanking a CSO would be potentially condemning an otherwise considerably valuable resource. Do you see that?
I do.
Do you agree that yanking a CSO could potentially condemn an otherwise valuable resource?
Not sure I would have used that terminology, but I mean, I believe it was their opinion that the CSO was valuable for sure, and it was something that they did not want to see terminated. As far as condemning the resource, I don't agree that it condemns the resource. In reality, any facility does not necessarily need a CSO to be built. In the state of Rhode Island, a facility needs an EFSB permit to be built. It does not need a CSO.
But that's what Invenergy said to FERC.
That was their opinion to FERC, yes.
All right, if we could now look at your third supplemental testimony on December 14th, 2018.
Okay.
I've got some preliminary questions that don't specifically direct you to your testimony at this point. In this testimony, you have indicated that you believe CREC will provide, if it's allowed to, if it's licensed, will provide a range of savings for both capacity and energy, correct?
That's correct.
Would you agree with me that in order for any of these capacity savings projections to be meaningful, CREC would have to be qualified to participate in a future forward capacity auction?
I mean, there was, I believe there was meaningful savings as a result of Clear River 1 clearing FCA 10 and also participating as a price taker in FCA 11. But as far as future savings projected in my third supplemental testimony, certainly the capacity savings are a direct result of being qualified to and clearing the forward capacity auction.
So if Invenergy does not qualify and clear in a future forward capacity auction, there would be no future capacity savings, correct?
That's correct.
And currently, as we've established, correct, is not qualified, correct?
They are not qualified to participate in FCA 13, but I don't believe there are currently any obstacles for them to participate in FCA 14 at this point.
But you don't know that for a fact. That's your opinion.
Sure, it is my opinion that there are no obstacles for them to participate in FCA 14.
But they have not been qualified for FCA 14.
That's correct.
And not only would they have to be qualified in order for these capacity savings to be realized in the future, but they would actually have to get one or more CSOs, correct?
That's correct.
Now, if I'm reading your testimony correctly, you've projected that correct Unit 1 and Unit 2 will receive CSOs in FCA 14. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, we went over this at length yesterday, and I'm not going to go into detail on this, but you also projected that Unit 1 and 2 would receive CSOs in FCA 10, correct?
That's correct.
And they didn't. Only Unit 1 did, correct?
That's correct.
And then you projected that Unit 2 would receive a CSO in FCA 11, but it didn't, correct?
That's correct.
And you
You
projected...
know, we go through this in incredible detail yesterday.
We did. Let me ask one question, if I could. You projected that Unit 2 would receive a CSO in FCA 12 and an FCA 13, but it didn't, correct?
Based on the assumption that they could participate in FCA 12 and 13, which they were not allowed to participate.
So I think we've established by looking at the ISO filings that 8,716 megawatts of new resources are qualified to participate in FCA 13. Is that correct?
That's what's listed in the document, yes.
You don't have any reason to doubt that, do you?
Yeah, I would. I guess it depends on how you define new resources.
Well, it was ISO that defined it. Do you define new resources differently from ISO?
No, I guess the importance is in the details of that, but I will accept what the ISO has put in that as new resources, yes.
You've reviewed Mr. Walker's December 14, 2018 testimony and his exhibits.
I have.
Would you agree with me that it's unlikely that the entire 8,716 megawatts of new resources will receive capacity supply obligations in FCA 14?
I would agree with that, yes.
And for capacity that fails, for any portion of the 8,716 megawatts of capacity that fails to receive a CSO in FCA 13, it's likely that a significant portion of that will be available to bid in 14, correct?
Potentially.
Do you recall that the ISO qualified 206 new capacity resources totaling 5,605 megawatts for the previous forward capacity auction in 12?
Talking about FCA 12?
Yes.
Yes.
And so would you agree with me that in round numbers, the new capacity resources increased from FCA 12 to FCA 13 by about 3,000 megawatts?
Based on those ISO numbers, yes.
And I know it's self-evident, but 3,000 megawatts is about 3 times the entire size of CREC, correct?
That's correct.
Now, we established yesterday that Invenergy covered its capacity supply obligation twice, correct?
Correct.
And would you agree with me that CSOs are fungible or interchangeable in the sense that capacity supply obligation can, under the ISO rules, be transferred to alternative capacity?
I would agree that that capacity supply obligations can be closed out if there is a counterparty available, either through an ARA or through a bilateral transaction with another counterparty.
Okay, that's fair. And
Could you explain that?
So if you have a capacity supply obligation for 5 megawatts, you have the obligation to provide that 5 megawatts during that capability period. If you don't, there are penalties associated with it. You can, if you are deciding that you want to close out of that obligation,
So you have to know in advance.
you would have to know in advance. That's correct. Once the capability period starts, that's your obligation for those 5 megawatts. Prior to that, the ISO runs the annual reconfiguration auctions, which we discussed yesterday, so you can offer that 5 megawatts into that auction. And to the extent there is a counterparty or a collection of counterparties, it doesn't necessarily have to be one. It could be 5 1-megawatt counterparties from the other side. The ISO will clear that capacity. Outside of the ARAs, you could go directly to another generator and do a contract directly with them where you transfer that 5 megawatt obligation to them. And that's something that has been done in the past. I'm not aware of a specific one in New England, but I am aware of ones that have been done in PJM in Atlantic where they've not used the ISO run auction and just done a direct bilateral contract.
And are there limitations on doing that in subsequent auctions? The same entity that has the capacity supply obligation?
Well, so in New England's tariff, there is the limitation, obviously, with any generator that has a 7-year CSO, if they close out.
And that would, only a new entrant would have the 7-year lock-in price, is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
Continue.
So under the tariff, if they close out of the obligation, if for 2 subsequent auctions, as we discussed yesterday, the ISO can terminate that CSO. As far as other limitations, I'm not sure. There may be other limitations in the details of the tariff around credit and other things, but I'm not sure of the finer details on that.
Isn't it also possible for that first year to essentially get a pass? Or
Yeah, you can also defer your obligation for 1 year. So Footprint Power did that. They received it. If it was 7 years at the time they did it, it might have been a 5-year CSO, and they were subject to delays on the construction of that asset. So they, rather than closing out that first year, they deferred it. So it basically shifted that 5 years just out by 1 year.
And so then the next year, they could use one of those other, if they were still not ready to operate, they could sell it or treat it obligation.
That's correct.
I'm just confused about one point. Is there a limit? So I understand the deferral. Is there a limit to how many times in that 7-year CSO price lock period that you can close it out?
I'm not sure. I know that if you do it for 2 years, it triggers the ISO's overall review and ability to terminate it. But if they didn't terminate it, are they allowed to do it for future years? I think so, but I'm not positive.
Because at the point you made about footprint, it's just this can't be. I can't remember what document it's in where it talks about permit delays at a state level and how that's sort of out of sync with this ISO New England process, and this can't be the only plant where the permitting is taking longer than expected, because that's a pretty normal occurrence.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering about other situations where it was handled differently other than a termination. Are you aware of any?
I'm not.
In terms of the counterparties that you were talking about, they have to be qualified by ISO, correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
So we don't know who the counterparty was on the two that were picked up in this case, but we do know that they must have been qualified by ISO.
Correct.
In terms of the deferral, there is a limit on how many times you can defer, correct?
I believe, in terms of deferral, I believe you can only defer in the initial year running.
And did you ever recommend to Invenergy that they consider asking for a deferral?
I never had discussions with Invenergy around deferral or closing out their CSOs. I wasn't party to any of those discussions.
Okay. Getting back to your calculation of capacity savings, given the fact that the CSO can be covered, transferred to a counterparty, would you agree with me the capacity price savings you calculated are not unique to the Clear River Energy Center, but would be generated by whoever picks it up?
No.
So if someone else has picked it up, there would be no savings generated by the Clear River Energy Center
I don't agree with that.
to the capacity side.
No, I don't agree with that.
Well, Clear River Energy Center would not be producing power. Somebody else would be covering that obligation, correct?
Yes, but producing power is when you say producing power, you mean energy. So yes, Clear River will not be producing energy, but Clear River capacity did clear FCA 10. It had an impact on the capacity price, lowering the capacity price, which has a direct impact on ratepayers.
I'm talking about future. Your future capacity savings that you calculated in December 14 testimony. Those future savings, if the CSO is transferred, would not be provided by, correct?
If you're talking about the savings that are calculated as part of my December 3rd supplemental testimony,
Yes.
those capacity savings are they're not based on any existing CSO. They're based on the assumption that Clear River 1 and 2 will be qualified to participate in FCA 14 and clear FCA 14.
Okay.
I'd just like to ask a follow-up. So how are you now projecting the $39 million in the savings, given the current lay of the land? Would there be a predicted ratepayer savings associated with the way things are now?
I believe so, yes, because even though Clear River 1's CSO has been terminated, it did clear FCA 10. So the resulting price of $7.03, which is the capacity cost that will impact not only Rhode Island ratepayers, but all ratepayers in New England, that price is lower due to the fact that Clear River 1 cleared FCA 10 and also participated in FCA 11. I can understand it is a bit odd, right, that a plant can have an impact on rates even if it's not, even if it doesn't get built for that year. And there have been comments, through the process of ISO New England's review of the CSO. There have been generators, Cogentrix is one of the companies that owns generation in New England, and they went to the ISO and said, look, essentially I'm paraphrasing, but they said, look, Clear River cleared and impacted prices, and from their perspective, they want higher capacity prices because they're a generator. And they said, this plant is impacting prices, and it's not going to be there. So I think there is agreement that this did have an impact, even though it won't be built for that capability period.
So you can predict savings that are independent of the plant operating.
That's correct.
But in order to achieve those savings, it has to clear.
On
That goes without saying.
the capacity side, yes. Yep, that's correct.
And that's where some of the concerns about gaming the system might come in?
Certainly, and that's, I mean, and that is, that is part of the tariff. I mean, I think, if we look at it, capacity markets, not only in New England, but across the markets, New York, PJM, they've only been operating for, I think the oldest go back to 2003, so we're talking about, 15 years of the market operating, and I think they continue to sort of make rule changes and tweaks and adaptations to respond and in the for the purpose of the market, operating as competitive and open and transparent as possible.
Probably part of, at least part of the reasons for having external and internal monitors.
Absolutely, that's certainly part of it.
Can you, if Invenergy had deferred for a year, what were the trade-offs there for them in terms of what would they have gained by deferring for a year and resetting that 7-year clock, and what would they have lost?
It's a good question. I think there is, it's probably, I think a lot, and I think maybe it's a better question for Invenergy in terms of what their thought process was behind it and how they thought about it. I mean, I think maybe just standing here now, kind of looking back in hindsight 2020, deferring a year maybe would have been a good decision if they had relative certainty that they could meet an online date that was 12 months later. And as we sit here today, we know that they can't meet that date, so the 1-year deferral probably wouldn't have helped them that much.
Okay, if we could start looking at your testimony, the December 14th testimony, I'd like to start by looking at page 5, please.
Okay.
And starting on line 16, you stated, in previous advisory opinions, the PUC explained that the URA, and the URA is the Utility Restructuring Act, correct?
Correct.
Has, quote, effectively repealed by implication the much older need assessment provision of the, end quote, Energy Facilities Siting Act, period. See advisory opinion in the matter of Indec North Smithfield, docket number 3094, dated August 17, 2000. Is that your answer?
That's correct.
Now, what you're pointing to here is that this was a statement made by the Public Utilities Commission, not the Energy Facilities Siting Board, correct?
That's correct.
And it was a statement made by the PUC in 2000, correct?
That's correct.
And the PUC's opinion was that the Utility Restructuring Act had effectively appealed by implication the need assessment provisions of the Energy Facilities Siting Act, correct?
Yes.
But it was never, the Energy Facilities Siting Act need provisions were never in fact repealed, were they?
Not to my knowledge.
All right. Are you aware that the Energy Facilities Siting Act was amended by the legislature in 2001, 2004, 2006, 2007, and 2008, but the need provision was never amended?
I will take your word for it on those dates, but I'm aware there have been amendments and it didn't impact need.
Okay.
Yes.
And are you aware that this board, the Energy Facilities Siting Board, has never said or ruled that the need provisions of the Energy Facilities Siting Act were effectively or in reality repealed by the Utility Restructuring Act or otherwise, correct?
I haven't read all their decisions, so I couldn't say.
But you're not aware of any decisions in which this board said that it thought that the need provisions in the Energy Facilities Siting Act no longer apply for whatever reason?
I'm not aware of that in either way, either direction.
In fact, this board, to the best of your knowledge, has continued to apply the traditional need analysis set forth in the Energy Facilities Siting Act in all of its decisions since 2000, correct?
Chairperson, the witness has already testified that he's not aware of what this board has done. I didn't object the first time, but I think it's been asked and answered. He's not qualified to answer that question.
I think that's correct.
Okay, I'll move on. You did reference in your answer, as I quoted, the INDEC decision or advisory opinion of the PUC, correct?
Yes,
So I'm assuming you've read the INDEC decision of this board?
I've read the PUC opinion on INDEC.
All right, I'm going to read you one sentence from the INDEC preliminary order in that same case and ask you if you're aware of this. Under issues to be considered by the board, this board stated, quote, "The statutory standards by which an application must be judged are found in the Act. Issue 1. Is the proposed project necessary to meet the needs of the state and/or the region for energy? RIGL section 42-98-11, parens B, parens 1." End quote. Have you read that?
It sounds familiar.
And you agree that this board must make a finding regarding need under the Energy Facility Siting Act?
Yes.
I'm going to read you two more sentences from the INDEC order. And I apologize, there's no page numbers on this order, but on the case-based printout, it's on page 7. But it says, "The traditional model of electric generating facilities built to meet the demands of the monopoly supplier has been radically altered through the passage of the Utility Restructuring Act. Utilities have divested their generating assets. Customers are no longer bound to purchase the utility's power supply. These changes in the electricity world have yet to be reflected in the Act." End quote. Now, is that your understanding?
Yes, and I agree with that, and that speaks directly to my reference of the PUC opinion that says the URA is effectively repealed by implication the much older need assessment provision of the Energy Facility Siting Act.
But this board has concluded that these changes have not yet been reflected in any changes to the Energy Facility Siting Act, correct?
I haven't read that whole opinion, but from the statement that you read, that's what it sounds like.
Now, you've read, I assume, the preliminary order of this board in this case on March 10, 2016?
I believe so.
And I'm going to read you two sentences from page 9 of that order. It says, "The statutory standards by which the application must be judged are found in the Siting Act. Issue 1. Is the proposed facility necessary to meet the needs of the state and/or region for energy of the type to be produced by the proposed facility?" End quote. Does that sound right to you?
Yes.
Anything in there that sounds like this board believes that the need provisions of the Energy Facility Siting Act have been repealed by implication?
I don't know. I agree with that statement.
Okay. Let's look at page 6 of your testimony. Actually, I need to start at the very bottom of page 5. So, the beginning of the very last sentence on page 5, "CREC is needed to cost effectively maintain," then we go over to the top of page 6, "reliability and ISO NE." That's one of the statements in this sentence in your testimony, correct?
Correct.
But we've already established that the ISO has terminated the CSO for Unit 1, correct?
Yes.
Right, the second part of that, there's a semi, and then it says, it's needed to support the introduction of more renewable energy projects into the ISO NE region, semi, correct?
Correct.
Now there, are you referring to the fact that this will be a fast start resource?
That's certainly part of the benefit that that this plant would produce in terms of supporting renewable energy products.
But when you say fast start for supporting renewable energy, you don't mean that it's fast enough that if suddenly the wind drops or a cloud moves over the sun, that this plant could immediately be able to supply energy?
Well, not immediately, but they could provide support in terms of fast ramping in enough time to provide that. So it's not.
What do you mean by fast?
There's not an immediate ramping product, but there are 10-minute and 30-minute products, and I believe the capabilities of this asset would allow it to provide that type of support in the market.
Mr. Hardy, you're aware that those products are traded in the Ford Reserve market?
Correct.
And you're aware that there are a number of plants already existing in New England that have both fast starting and fast ramping capabilities, correct?
There are, yes. I also think that the amount of fast start or fast ramping product, fast ramp or a fast start capacity that's going to be required in ISO New England is going to increase dramatically over the next decade as the existing capacity changes and obviously goes to more renewable capacity in New England.
But would you agree with me that as of now, in the current forward reserve market, there is more than enough existing capacity to meet the calculated demand by ISO for fast start and fast ramp?
That's correct.
While you're pausing, I'll take an opportunity. So you just made a statement that sounds a lot like Mr. Fagan's statement, which is large procurements of new renewables are coming into the New England electricity marketplace. You just said something similar. And
Yes.
when you were talking about,
Yep.
then you said that we would need more fast start or fast ramp up because more renewables are coming into the marketplace.
Yes.
Do you, so I had a question, so I might as well ask it now, about since the beginning of your testimony, and you did reference in page 22 of this recent filing, the Vineyard Wind project, but how much capacity of offshore wind is currently in process, and how many megawatts generally, I don't expect you to have the exact number, kind of coming into this New England electricity market, or including, well, I'll just leave it at that. So, the question being, how much are renewables, at what rate are they ramping up, which you just referenced creates a bigger need for fast start, but also changes the dynamic of the whole marketplace.
Sure. I can't remember exactly what number of megawatts we assume in our analysis, but if I had to roughly pick a number, I would say there's probably 5 to 6 gigawatts of offshore renewable that are probably coming in, over the next 10 years. I think that the timing of some of that is uncertain. But when you look at, the state policies and targets in Rhode Island, in Massachusetts, the overall renewable portfolio standards, when we analyze the market going forward, we assume that the states and New England as a whole are going to meet those targets. And to meet those targets, you're going to need a significant amount of renewables. Offshore wind is going to be part of that solution. Solar is going to be part of that solution. Onshore wind will be part of that solution, and storage will be part of that solution. And we include all of those in our analysis. It's not a trade-off of Clear River or renewables. In our view, and this isn't just New England, this is all markets. To keep markets reliable, you need a mix of, thermal and renewable. You need a mix of intermittent and dispatchable resources to keep a market reliable. And so that's kind of how we see it going forward. Sure.
So Looking again on page 6, the fourth bullet point, you stated that while the NICR, the net installed capacity requirement, is minimum, I think there might be a typo there, there should be amount.
Sorry, what page?
Page 6,
Okay.
right in the middle of the page, line 14, bullet 4. I think there's a typo in this bullet, but I want to ask you about the bullet. I'll let you correct the typo.
Okay.
While the NICR is, should say the minimum
the minimum.
amount
Yeah,
instead of about,
The minimum amount.
okay, of capacity that is required, capacity above the NICR is still needed, correct?
That's correct.
And in fact, capacity above the NICR, as the chairperson pointed out yesterday, has been regularly and easily procured by ISO in the recent auctions, correct?
Capacity above NICR has normally been procured above the NICR, that's correct.
I think you're responding to a data request or a record request from the board in that regard, correct?
Yes. I think actually Mr. Blazer said it is in the record somewhere, we just have to point that out.
Okay, I don't,
Agree, Mr. Blazer, you were to talk about the surplus, I think, for the amount of the,
It's actually, it's the summary that's attached to Mr. Hardy's December testimony, I believe.
It's somewhere in these attachments.
Yeah, it's in there. I can't remember whose, but during somebody's examination or cross-examination.
Maybe during lunch you can point us to it in the afternoon.
now, staying on page 6, and I know Mr. Elmer touched on this with you yesterday, but I want to make sure that I'm clear about this. Beginning on line 20, in the middle of the question, it says, does the fact that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, granted ISO NE's request to terminate CREC Unit 1's CSO mean that the plant is no longer needed? And your answer was absolutely not. In fact, quite the opposite. Mr. Elmer asked you about that, and I'd like to just explore that just a little bit. It seems to me that you've argued in your previous testimonies that having the CSO was an important factor in determining whether or not the plant was needed, correct?
Yes.
But now that you no longer have the CSO, it seems that you're arguing that not having the CSO also means the plant is needed. Is that really what you're saying?
That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that I've made the statement that having a CSO is a clear indication of need and certainly an important factor in need. But I'm also clearly stating that the inverse is not true. Not having a CSO does not mean the plant is not needed.
And I heard you, and you went through that with Mr. Elmer, it was very clear. What's unclear to me is, your question is, and I'll read it again, does the fact that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission granted ISO NE's request to terminate CREC Unit 1 CSO mean that the plant is no longer needed? Answer, absolutely not. In fact, quite the opposite. So quite the opposite, the only way I can read that is that you're arguing that no longer having the CSO is evidence that the plant is needed. Am I reading that incorrectly?
Chairperson, I told Mr. McElroy I wasn't going to object as asked and answered when he covered things that Mr. Elmer already had, and I haven't, but now he's covered it twice. Mr. Hardy has answered that question at least 3 times over the last 2 days. He's explained what he means by his answer.
You can answer it this time.
Thank you.
So in my explanation here and in the answer to Mr. Elmer yesterday, what I was trying to convey in that answer is that the process that they've gone through, if you read the ISO New England's termination filing, they talk about the importance of planning and understanding what capacity is going to be available, not only for meeting the net ICR, but for transmission planning and interconnection studies for the calculation of the ICR itself. I think that speaks to the importance of every megawatt, that clears a CSO, which includes Clear River. And the fact that they go through this process and have this structure and these tariffs in place speaks to that. So that is what my answer was meant to convey.
So you're not trying to say that the termination of the CSO means that the plan is needed?
I'm not trying to say that the termination itself indicates need, no.
All right, thank you. I need to go to the bottom of page 7 and up to the top of page 8. And this is the reference, this is the quote from the ISO decision. And line 32 says, therefore our decision to accept ISO NE's request and deny Invenergy's waiver should not be construed as a determination by the Commission that the Clear River project is not needed, as that question is not before us. Do you see that quote?
I do.
And you put that in here, correct?
Correct.
And would you agree with me that what the Commission is saying fairly clearly here is that the issue of need was simply not legally before the Commission for determination?
I believe what I was trying to say by that quote is that the termination of ISO New England's, the termination of the CSO and FERC's approval of that has nothing to do with need.
Well, in fact, what the Commission was saying was the question of need is not before them, correct?
That's not why I used the quote. I believe Mr. Fagan and Mr. Walker both pointed to FERC's decision and said, this is a clear indication that the plan is not needed. I disagree with that opinion, and that's why I included and referenced this letter and this quote in particular.
But the bottom line is that FERC, in making this ruling, made no determination one way or another as to whether or not the plan was needed. Is that fair to say?
They did not deal with need
At all?
in that decision.
At all, correct?
That's correct.